Alright guys, so in this video what I'm going to go through is the importance of scapular positioning during pressing exercises, and I've got a few implements here, okay, and this is to illustrate an important point, and that is that, you know, it goes back to the stuff that we discussed in the very basic exercise mechanics. We went over it at the very beginning of the anatomy content, and that is that, you know, the greater distance you have, or the greater the angle, to really simplify it, the greater the angle of inclination of the fibers that are inserting onto a bone, moving at a joint, the greater potential there is for movement. And I'll explain why that is now. But what I mean by that, by angle of inclination, if you've got a muscle that's inserting, right? So my hand here is the joint between that bar and my hand, okay? So that's the joint there. And what's happening is I'm pulling with this black band, which can be thought of as my muscle. And if I'm more inclined up here, there's going to be more tendency for rotation to be created, okay? Very simple. That's going to create way more rotation. It's like when you try to open a door, you don't stand behind the door and try to like pull it along its side. You just pull on the handle. It's perpendicular to the door itself, okay? So that's like there. If you're opening a door, you just pull back that way, okay? And that creates rotation. Very simple. If you were to pull it like this, if you're standing here and you're trying to pull the door back into the hinge, it doesn't really move, okay? So yeah, there's going to be some movement created, but it's not as great. So effectively what happens is, if we have a muscle, and these are the muscle fibers, if they're inserted at more of an angle like that onto a bone, they're going to create more rotation. If they're down closer like this, they're going to create less rotation. And that's for the simple fact that there's going to be less of a moment arm between the line of force created by the fibers and the joint axis. So in this case, the fibers are pulling further away from the joint axis, and as a result, they create more rotation. In this case, the fibers are pulling straight along the joint axis, and as you can see, it just slipped off, but they weren't creating any rotation. So there was no rotation created, it was just pulling straight into the joint, and that's not very effective if we're trying to create rotation. So now, what I want you to think of is this is your pec muscle. This is the shoulder, my hand, that's the shoulder joint. This is the pec muscle. That's the humerus, the arm. Basically what I'm trying to illustrate is that if we've got a pec that inserts more like this onto the arm, it's going to create more rotation. If it inserts like this, it's going to create less rotation, or have less of a tendency to create rotation. Now what does that mean, and how on earth does that relate to scapular positioning? Now, the reason that relates to scapular positioning is because if Paddy's just flat on the bench here, okay, you're flat, your shoulders are resting in a normal position, and you have your arm out to the side. If he has his arm just resting there, okay, what we've got is we've got pec fibers that are inserting down into this arm. There's a slight angle there, but it's not great, okay? If you shove your shoulder forward into protraction, there's almost no angle now, okay? Now it's just kind of like running straight across. There's of course some curvature to the fibers, but it's far less effective at creating rotation at the shoulder, because if you even think about what's happening now, you can kind of see that bump in his shoulder there, that if he has these fibers here that are pulling on this part of the upper arm of the humerus, it's basically going to shove it into the joint. It's just going to pull it in across. So yeah, there will be rotation created, but it's not going to be as effective, okay? Whereas if he pinches that shoulder back maximally, so he's really exaggerating pinching the shoulder back, now what we've got is we've got the origin of the pec, we've elevated it, okay? So we've got this steep sternal angle, we've got the rib cage elevated, we've arched our back, we've pinched the shoulder blade back. Now what's happening is there's this steep decline, okay, or incline. And as a result, the line of pull is coming down onto the shoulder at more of an angle. So that result of that is that he's going to be able to create rotation more effectively, okay? It's a very simple concept, but basically what it allows you to do is produce more force in that bottom position. So if you're trying to get the most out of your pecs, or you're trying to improve your bench press, pinching your shoulder blades back and arching up that back not only allows you to be more comfortable on the bench, but also allows you to actually get more mechanical advantage from your pecs. So it's just a straight up mechanical effect. So that's obviously desirable. Now, you can relax the arm down. Other than that, there are other things, okay? It's not just the mechanical advantage concept. It's also the fact that if Paddy's able to arch his back and pinch his shoulder blades back in together, what happens now is that if he's using his legs for force, he's trying to really get tight on the bench, it's all being transmitted into this upper back position. So because everything's super tight here, it means that it's going to be more difficult to move him out of position, okay? Whereas if he's got his back real flat on the bench and everything's just kind of flailing around, like it's easier to move him on the bench now, okay? So as a result, if the weight's coming down and it's really heavy, you know, his shoulders are going to be less stable. He's going to be less stable on the bench and less able to transmit force if he's trying to use as much force as possible to move the weight, okay? So it's just not an effective way of lifting from a basic stability perspective, okay? The other thing there as well, along with the concept of the more mechanical advantage, is that if Paddy pinches the shoulder blades back, it's going to be easier for him to use the range of motion that he has available, okay? So he's going to find it easier to get back into that shoulder extension range of motion while keeping everything pinched back. Whereas if you flatten yourself out now and you try to touch your chest there, what's happening is like his shoulder's just going to rotate forward a little bit maybe, it's coming up off the bench, okay? It's just not in a really strong position, it's not a stable position, and it's not a comfortable position either. So overall, we've got a number of things that come together to converge on the cue that people give so often, and that is to pinch your shoulder blades down and back, get your back tight when you're performing a bench press. So you've got the thing that we talked about, mechanical advantage of the pec. It's going to enable you to use your pecs more effectively, really important concept. It's going to enable you to work through a large range of motion a little bit easier and in a more stable, comfortable and potentially safe position as well. So all of those things would suggest that this is the best way of performing pressing type exercises. It doesn't mean that you need to always have your shoulders pinched, you know, back and down and locked into a fixed position, because you can make the case that, you know, there are exceptions to that. For example, in a push-up, what you might want to do is actually allow for some movement because you're not stuck against the bench anymore, and you've got freedom at the upper body. You don't need it to be super stable anymore, okay, because you're not trying to fix yourself to a bench. And, you know, by moving the shoulders through other ranges of motion, that allows you to train different muscles slightly, bringing in the serratus anterior, bringing in some protraction, and then you're not constantly hammering the same movements and the same joint structures over and over again, which is, you know, beneficial from a longevity perspective. And in addition to that, what you can also do is if you're doing fly type exercises, for example, cable flies, protracting forward and allowing the shoulders to roll forward can allow you to, you know, bring that pec into an even shorter position because you are dragging that insertion again towards the origin. So all of these things, you know, they're never black and white, but for the most part, for our pressing exercises at least, it's definitely advisable to try to get someone to master that art of keeping the shoulders back and keeping them down and keeping themselves as tight as possible on the bench.